Great. Thank you, everybody. Welcome so much for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. And we have a small crowd here, but many of our members of the Ad Hoc Committee on Redistricting are here. So we're going to have a chance to introduce them to you. I'm Diane Meyerhoff. I'm helping out the committee with the meeting tonight and our future meetings as well. Our first order of business is our public forum, where we allow 2 minutes per person to speak. Is there anyone in the room or on the remote Zoom who would like to make a comment? Okay, hearing none. We want to talk a little bit, this is our agenda for the day, the evening. Obviously, we're in the welcome. We're going to talk about, we're going to have an overview of redistricting by city staff. We're going to have a facilitated discussion on the criteria and priorities for redistricting, and then we'll talk about the next steps. And again, this is our first meeting, first listening session of a set of 3 meetings that we're going to have between November and December. So next up. This is the committee makeup and purpose. Again, this is the Ad Hoc Committee for Redistricting that was that the City Council resolution required us to put together. The committee includes 1 member from each ward, selected by the NPAs, the Neighborhood Planning Associations. It's independent of the City Council, the school board, and former elected officials of any of those bodies. The purpose, as stated by the council of the committee, is to gather input into the current redistricting plan, review the past plan when there were 7 wards and 14 councilors, and we'll talk more about that, hear opinions about the number of councilors per ward or district, and consider the current ward district configuration. So that is the charge of the committee. And the committee is to hold public meetings like this. They are to provide a report or memo to the City Council in the end of January. And the council is really looking to get general perspectives around the number of councilors and wards and districts, and opinion about the most recent current plan as well as the past plan. So that's the charge of the committee. And next up, I think is to introduce everyone? Yeah, so let's have all the committee members introduce themselves. You do need to use the microphone for the remote folks. And I will also say that I am fairly new to hybrid meetings, so I apologize if we don't do a good job of this, but we're going to try to put everybody at microphones. That's probably number 1 most important. And we can pull one off if you'd rather pass it around rather than stand up. Would you rather have it? Yeah. That's good with you guys, right? Yeah, good, okay. So we'll just go around the room and tell us your name and what ward you're from.
Hey, my name is Daniel Montanu, and I live in ward number 3.
Richard Hilliard, ward number 1.
My name is Anne Brenya, and I'm from Ward 8.
Greg Shepler, ward 5.
George Love, ward 2.
Jim Holloway, Ward 4.
Did we get everyone? And online? Robert?
All right. I'm Robert Bristol Johnson. I'm from Ward 7.
Great, thank you. Do we get all the members who are here?
No, Rama.
Yeah, I'm Rama Kochi Lakota, and I'm from Ward 6.
I'm sorry, Ram, I didn't know you were over there. Apologies.
No worries.
Great.
I'm also here, Carol Livingston from Ward 1.
Great, thank you, Carol. Anybody else? Okay, hearing none. We'll move on. Thank you so much, everyone, for introductions. And now we're going to have Dan Richardson, the city attorney, give you a little overview of redistricting. And really what we're trying to do is kind of level the playing field so everyone is starting in the same place when we talk about redistricting. So, Dan, I will get out of your way.
Thank you. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And if you don't mind, I'm going to take this off just so I can articulate a little bit better. So the question is, what is redistricting? And these are some of the legal parameters and background for it, which is that the Constitution requires that the United States do a census every 10 years to determine the distribution of House of Representatives seats. And on the national level, each state gets at least one House seat plus additional seats based on population. This is known as apportionment. Each state must then adjust its voting districts to elect the number of seats allotted by creating or changing geographic subdivisions to have relatively equal-sized population. This is known as redistricting. The same principles apply at each level of government, including the city of Burlington. So every 10 years, the city of Burlington is under a legal obligation to look at its population, its wards, its districts, and to establish whether or not it needs to redistrict and how to redistrict, because populations almost invariably shift and change over time. And as Megan and some of the other presenters have shown, this year is no different than other years. So there will have to be some sort of redistricting. And just at the federal level, we have it easy in Vermont. We have one House seat. It never changes. We never have to do any type of redistricting of congressional seats. But as we're seeing at the state level, there is a lot of redistricting. Burlington is divided among 7 House seats since 2014. At the city level, is 8 wards and 4 districts for local electoral offices, and those things are both going to, you know, at least the proposal at the state level is that change. And one of the things that you're going to be determining or making, not determining, but recommending to the city council is whether the city system should or shouldn't change. I saw a hand.
If the census had not shown a variance in population among the wards, would there be any need to redistrict? In other words, is there any other rationale for the redistricting process other than equalizing the number of people in each ward?
No, I mean, you know, which is to say 10 years tends to be generally when cities and towns and states do redistricting, you know, even if the population has not overall really changed, but invariably it does. I'll give an example of one place that hasn't changed, just because the population, there hasn't been a lot of growth, is the city of Montpelier, where I happen to live. And we've had 3 wards since time out of mind, or at least I've lived there over 20 years, and it's always had 3 wards. And the boundaries of the wards have shifted slightly over time, but not that much. And so they've generally kept the same basic framework overall, and which is ironic, of course, because in Montpelier, the city council can change the ward configuration by mere vote of the city council. It doesn't require, like Burlington does, a charter change. So there's a certain irony that they have perhaps more flexibility for changing wards, but less need than Burlington that may have, because it's a bigger population shift over time, there's adjustments, but yet it's a more involved system because it's ultimately, we're talking about, in this case, a charter change.
Okay. But nobody could just say, we're unhappy with the way the wards are configured and therefore we want to change them, even if.
Oh, you can always do that.
Okay.
But you'd have to gain a certain consensus, and the driving factor for redistricting is changes in population.
Okay.
In the year 2000, there wasn't enough change in Burlington to require redistricting.
Yep. And I mean, look, this is a hard process to go through because it involves changing things, and there's always that risk of change. You know, everyone thinks they have, it could be done better until you actually try and do it better, and then you realize, wow, we have a really good system. So obviously, if you don't have the population shifts, that takes a lot of the wind out of the redistricting sail. Yes?
Dan, you mentioned that it's likely that the state legislature is going to increase the number of districts for Burlington.
Well, yeah, not, you know,
It's not set in stone yet. but
not at
it's-
all.
Would it be advantageous for this committee to wait to see what those changes are before we act?
Well, yes and no. I mean, you know, that's ultimately, I think, in part how, so let me say on a strict level, the city has almost never tied, or at least in recent history, has never tied its voting wards at the local level to its state districts for the State House of Representatives. And you see that in the way it sort of unfolds now, that, you know, the 7 representatives do not match up with the 7 or the 8 wards in any way, shape, or form. But, you know, there is that possibility. I mean, what's the big change on the table for the state legislature this year is that the redistricting committee has recommended for the first time single-member districts. So a number of districts in Burlington and other communities in Vermont have 2-member districts. So you elect 2 or more members from the same district. The proposal that is being sent to the legislature that the redistricting committee has announced, it does away with that. Now, redistricting is ultimately a political process, so I'm always leery to say, well, it looks like the state is going to do that. I think that may be a little bit of the cart ahead of the horse, because it's a political process, and so until the political heavies weigh into that, it's only a potential. And Megan's going to add something.
I think the only other thing that I wanted to add, Greg, to your question about whether you should wait until the state districts are drawn, I think one of the questions that this committee is asking for feedback on is how much Burlington's districts should reflect state districts. And so I think that to some degree, the answer to that depends on how much that matters to people in our local community.
That's an excellent point. And I think, you know, part of this process, at least at this level, is very much about, you know, what are the values and what are the goals of redistricting at, you know, based on public feedback. And part of it may be, we would like to see that match up. Certainly, city staff would like that because it makes elections a lot easier. But we're not the ones who drive that, because that's not a good reason to adopt or not adopt a particular district. That's just an ease of convenience for staff, and we understand that at the end of the day there may be greater values that overwhelm that ease of transaction for, you know, consistency of neighborhoods, keeping them together. So fully recognizing that we can't control the state process, but that may be a value. People may say, you know what, it would make sense for it to match up. And there are arguments you could put forward, and you could say having state reps and city reps in the same district would give them the ability to align interests and would increase our voice. We would speak in a single voice all the way up to the State House, you know, through City Hall to the State House. And there's certainly a value there. And some, but, you know, as other people have argued, or at least, you know, as the prevailing systems have been, no, these other values are more important, whether they be, you know, our traditional ward district configuration, or, you know, it may be the difference between having a certain neighborhood with 2 representatives rather than 1 at the city level. And that may be driving considerations at the end of the day. But I think as an overall question, that's a really excellent one. I will go into them. So we're meandering our way through this, don't worry. So these are traditional redistricting factors, which I have started to allude to, and I've broken them into 2 components. One are the must-haves. These are the ones on which any redistricting plan is judged and whether it will succeed or fail under legal scrutiny. And that's first of all, the most important is really the 1 person, 1 vote. That's required by the 14th Amendment. And that talks about deviations of less than 10%. You know, that's actually one of the criticisms that's been leveled at the one-member redistricting at the state level is when you break down the districts into one representatives, you break down the population so that any fluctuation that occurs, which will naturally occur, is going to trigger the need for redistricting sooner rather than the more stable, larger districts. So, but, you know, there are always trade-offs in these things. The other issue is contiguity of territory. That's one part of a district cannot be physically separate or detached from the other parts. And, you know, there's often, in these discussions, Ward 8 comes up as a sort of classic gerrymander because it looks like a little salamander that comes through the downtown of the city. But you'll notice it all touches each other. And that's the basic rule. If you can't have one part here and there. And the third part is you cannot make separate districts or do redistricting decisions on the basis of race, ethnicity, or religion. So, for example, if you had, you know, perhaps a large religious group that lived in one neighborhood and you said, well, let's just keep those people together. You couldn't do that. That it would be struck down faster than you could say, have we filed in federal court yet? Same thing with ethnicity and race. Those are just protected classes, not allowed. Should-haves. Maintaining existing political subdivisions or lines. And when I say should-haves, these are things that generally, if we think about what you're building here or what you're recommending, you know, what currently exists has passed muster. It's survived for close to 6 years. It's not been challenged. It's clearly acceptable on a certain level. We now have to change, but you know, there's always a question of, well, how much do you change? And this point is just simply the less you change, the safer you are in some of these areas. But they also represent other certain values. So maintaining existing political subdivision lines, honoring natural or historic boundary lines, creating compact districts are always favored, you know, but again, it's not necessary. As we see, the salamanders live, you know, but obviously a compact district is a easier to defend district. Respect for communities of interest, which means that if there is a particular, and we've talked about this at prior meetings, but communities of interest are it's a very specific term, and it means you know, it has a flexible meaning, but it's something that the community itself says, well, this is important. Someone could say the Old North End is a community of interest because it has a certain identity to it that's worth preserving. Or the New North End is a community of interest because it has an identity that's worth preserving. Another should have, providing small districts for meaningful representation. You know, you could divide the city into just 2 districts, be done, go home, north, south, east, west. But, you know, you have the system already where that would mean you would be letting go of some of the smaller districts and some of the ability for voices to be heard. You know, if you divide it into larger districts, immediately then you're limiting how much voice smaller communities within these districts would have because you're enlarging the district. And that's generally, you should have better, you know, voices for the population size. A 40,000 person city is probably a good 7 districts or 8 districts is not too far off, so that everybody has, because if you do that, then about roughly every 5,000 person has or can claim a representative of some sort. Providing use of census blocks, grouping of houses and apartment buildings that are the smallest unit the census uses. You know, obviously we don't divide through backyards, we don't divide up properties, put the accessory dwelling in one district and another. You know, honoring those type of things. Those are just sort of things that are in the background at the bottom. But a lot of these things are not absolutely necessary. So the next slide is taking up, in 2010, these were the evaluation criteria that people in your seats looked at. Total number of counselors divided by population, the number of wards. These were all just points that they said, are these important to us? Are these, you know, what are the interest here? keeping geographic areas intact, minimizing the population differences between wards, boundaries following major roads as much as possible. Academic institutions should be in more than one ward. Ward size matters for citizen communication and campaigning. Minimize changes from current wards. Relationship to state districts, that question came up 10 years ago and probably come up in 10 years from now as well. Overall deviation of less than 10%. So these were things that they considered. Obviously, we have a mixture of some of the must-haves and the should-haves, and then some policy questions. So for example, whether an academic institution should be in more than one ward, that depends, and that's a policy decision that ultimately, and if you think of this process, part of what you're gathering is what are people's inclinations, and what are people's, do they have a sense this makes sense or doesn't make sense? And then from there, we can start to develop arguments about why does this policy make sense over another policy, and then start to make those, and the city councilors ultimately making a lot of these decisions. These are additional potential considerations for 2021. A lot of these I've put into the form of a question because the question is, are these important? Maybe they aren't. Preserving incumbency, is it important? Do you generally like the makeup? Or is this something where we should shake it up, where we're getting the sort of wrong mix of candidates and we could do better if we changed the way those districts or wards were set up? Do we keep the current number of wards? Do we keep districts? Should areas of large student population be kept together or broken up into multiple wards? Do we keep neighborhoods intact? At-large city councilors, and the at-large concept, we have sort of a modified at-large with the districts, but some cities, for example, have an at-large city councilor who runs for the entire city, or 2 or 3 that are just sort of at-large. And there are benefits and there are negatives to it. And I'd be happy at any point in time to discuss those, but that's one question. Even versus odd number of city councilors. We have the mayor who provides the veto, but right now we have a city council that if there's only one way to pass something, and that's to get a majority. If it's even, it's a deadlock, and essentially it fails. And so traditionally, the legislature has favored odd-numbered boards for that reason, but clearly Burlington has been allowed to have the even number, and so it's not a fatal flaw, but there may be a reason to change that. Multiple representatives per ward. Right now, we have one rep per ward.
Go ahead.
Okay, we have, but that's not what has always been historically. I know that there was at one point in time, at least the last round, we were talking about 2 representatives per ward and 7 wards. So, is that a value? Next slide.
Before we leave that slide, I was wondering if I could ask you a question on the student population issue. As you alluded to, many of these have positives and negatives, and of course, one of the things that we'll be doing in our ward meetings might be to try to encourage people to look at both sides of the issue. So it's helpful for us to have your level of understanding, if possible, on some of these. So I just find the whole student thing interesting and sort of confusing at the same time, because on the previous slide, you said one of the things that wasn't a must-have, but a should-have, is to respect communities of interest. And I guess you could argue that students have similar interest. And yet on the next slide, you mentioned that the 2010 criteria really was to sort of examine that, to spread that out. And of course, that's a potential consideration this time, what should be done. So I'm wondering if you could extrapolate on maybe some of the advantages and disadvantages. I know that previously we talked about the fact that, well, maybe you've got a large population of students, but they may not all vote, and so maybe that's a little bit of a misleading situation in terms of, when I say not all vote, I mean not all vote in Burlington. I mean, that's right. I don't mean to be disingenuous about anyone's interest in voting.
Sure. No, Greg, that's a great set of questions, and I'll unpack it and a little bit, and hopefully touch upon all of it, because I think it's in and of itself worthy of an evening, almost an evening of discussion. But if you think about it, I think you hit upon a number of these. If you look at a student population, they are inherently not necessarily a homogeneous group. So characterizing them as a sort of community of interest may be worthy, and that's why, again, it's a little bit of an art about what communities of interest are. They may not be. They may be too disparate. You may have people that have all kinds of different interests. Like you say, some people who really don't view themselves as Burlington residents, but are voting at home, wherever home may be for them. Or you may have people that have very strong local interest, or may say, I'm living here, I'll vote here, but I really don't have a connection to this community. They may be all over in interests. There may be people that are looking to stay, people looking to go, people, just it may not have that coherence. That's certainly something that could be argued with as large of a student population. They may have, to counter that, they may have very strong interests. They may have very, certainly if you asked any student, I suspect rent issues might be a common theme, living conditions. But, these are also people who may or may not work in the community. They may be, attending classes. I know, and I only say that because I know when I went to college, I didn't work full time. But I have my brother, when he went to college, he did work full time. So, it can be very different types of connections to the community just in that way. The other issue often is that we do see a lot of student populations that don't necessarily vote because they're not here full time or full year round. And so especially in this post-COVID era, there may be a large student population in terms of beds and the way we calculate the population, but smaller actual population in terms of being present and actually voting in these elections. And so, there may be, and I would look to, some of the data as far as voting returns over the past, we now have 6 years of data from Ward 8, which is a very student-heavy population that you can look to and say, how did their voting turnout rates look to other parts of the community? Because, that may be something for the city to consider if a student ward, if a heavily student-based ward has overall fewer people casting votes than, say, another ward, that may be a consideration of fairness and policy in that, do we really want to give an entire ward a voting block based on, what are ultimately lower democratic returns? So just as the same way as if you had it's like a summer community that for some reason counted on your census, which it doesn't, but that people didn't end up voting, you might take that into consideration. Wouldn't just simply count the houses, but you'd actually count, look to see how the Democratic participation in that particular district or ward reflected that. And that's certainly an argument. Now, the other thing is that, look, the student population clearly does have some interest and does have some passion and does have some involvement in the city. I mean, you don't have to attend too many city council meetings to walk away without the understanding that there is a certain portion of the student body that is very engaged in local government and very passionate about the decisions that are made. So, I think those all go into that discussion, and UVM is an incredibly important partner in the city of Burlington as far as jobs and the population go, and there may be a reason to structure it one or another way. I hope that hits some of the points.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Very good job. My question sort of relates to the outcome of redistricting related to the approximate equal population criteria. Mm-hmm. So I see that taking one of two forms. So the first is the goal that each resident have equal representation, or is that for each representative to represent an equal bit of the population? And does the city have the flexibility in terms of how to structure that outcome? Does that question make sense?
I think so, and I'll certainly let Megan chime in if I don't hit it right on the head on the answer. But you know, the primary legal measurement is the latter of your two propositions, which is you create equal districts which is to say if each district, if it's 500 people in Ward 1, 500 people in Ward 2, 500 people in Ward 3, then you're doing a good job. And it's that as opposed to, although what, if I'm, and maybe let me unpack your first idea, which is.
If I can rephrase the question, would help it a little bit. And the reason that this dilemma comes to mind is because I know that the question of ward representation versus district representation is a big topic this time around, okay? So, as a resident, I feel like I have equal representation because I have a ward representative and I have a district representative. And so I essentially have two voices on the city council, as does everybody else in the city. So,
oh, sure.
Okay, so regardless of the sort of the population breakdown, everybody has equal representation.
Right.
Okay, and then so if you flip that around, you know, as far as, you know, each representative, do they represent an equal population? Technically, the answer is no.
Yeah, no, I see what you're,
okay,
sorry.
So you,
yeah.
Okay?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I apologize. I was yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of what I'm getting at is that, you know, is that going forward a legitimate legal structure if we recognize that, you know, we're creating this two-tier system, but still providing equal representation for the whole population?
Yes, and I want to strike my last answer in light of your very excellent clarification because, and say the exact opposite, which is that it's the first part where everyone has equal representation, which is you couldn't create, say, give Ward 1 and Ward 2 also district representation and not give district representation to other wards. So absolutely, that is the key there. And the fact that representatives are of different shapes and forms, which is to say some represent a ward, you know, then say, just use my round numbers because I'm bad at math, but, you know, whereas a city councilor represents a ward of 500 and a district councilor who represents a ward, who represents a district of 1,000, that's okay. That's perfectly legitimate. And in fact, some municipalities, like I said, have what are called at-large. Well, if you think about it, a select board is a classic at-large where they're elected by the entire town. And so, you know, we could easily have at-large city councilors who are elected the same way the mayor is with the entire population of the city. And they'd still be city councilors with no greater vote. But they'd have to obviously campaign for the entire city to win a seat. And there are reasons why that kind of structure benefits, because it's the idea that that these district representatives or at-large representatives bring to the forward voices of a district. So they kind of bridge. A ward might have specific issues, but two wards together might have a different set of issues, and a district representative is able to voice those sort of greater concerns or act as bridges between different city councilors. You know, and again, this is one of those things where people may say, yeah, that may look nice on paper, but in practice, it's not so great. Or some people may say, this is great because I have two, like you said, I have two voices on city council. It is a nice way. I know last time, and let's be practical, it elided a problem, which is they wanted to have, like you said, two voices for districts, but they didn't want to increase the size of the city council. So they actually shrunk the size of the city council and continued sort of the double voices.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
I think the only thing I'll just say too is that Dan was helpful in explaining that that is a legal structure in terms of the representation question, but then whether that's a system we want to perpetuate is a question that this committee is also charged with getting feedback from the community on as well.
That's right.
Yeah, and I raised the question just to establish that construct is still legally viable.
Right, yes. So the point was just for the folks listening at home, it was, Jeff clarified that he raised the question just to make sure that construct was legally viable.
Yep.
Online has a question. We can't see you, unfortunately. Carol, do you have a question you want to ask? I'm sorry.
Yes, I do. I'm sorry. Thank you. I appreciate you waiting. And this is sort of maybe a red herring. I'm assuming that we're also talking about the school board commissioners as well? Because that's the same configuration, is that right?
I believe so. I haven't looked at the specific school board commissioner, but they usually follow.
Yeah, yep.
yeah.
This would affect the elections for school board members as well.
Okay, so we're really making decisions about both those bodies.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I'm just stretching.
Oh, okay.
Keep going.
Ready for next slide? All right. This is still me, right? Okay.
So this next slide just shows one of the things that this committee, the ad hoc committee, is asked to do is to help gain feedback about the current redistricting plan, or what we refer to as the wards that you vote in today, and also feedback about the most recent redistricting plan, which was the ward system that we had in place between 1993 and 2014. So this map that's on this slide is just showing the two different ward configurations, current and most recent past. And for those of you that are in the room, we do also have them printed and on the wall, so you can take a look at them in a format that's a little bit easier to see. So we just wanted to share this with you, as Dan was just going over the criteria that were used to evaluate and make the ward structure that was effective in 1993, and then the criteria that were used, to move us from the wards that were effective starting in 1993 to the ones that we have today. And then the only other point that I just wanted to make here is that Dan mentioned, I think Robert actually chimed in and mentioned that we have not always had to redistrict every time a census was done in Burlington. I think we've had maybe 6 or 7 different ward configurations since the city was founded. So you can see here that the one on the left was the result of the 1990 census. We did not redistrict after the 2000 census, and the one that we have today was a result of the 2010 census. So we're now considering changes that we have to make as a result of the 2020 census.
Thanks, Megan. And that's really helpful. And, this is maybe I'll just make this quick point. It's an observation, which is, it's pretty rare that we get to redraw not municipal, but governmental lines. If you think about it, City of Burlington is what it looks like and has looked like for a long time, and that's not going to change in this. County of Chittenden is the way it looks since, the Federalists were still in office, in large part. But we get to do this change, and that comes with both risks as well as benefits. The risks, of course, is that, there are these established and there are these wards for a reason. These didn't just arise sua sponte, or, from the forehead of Zeus if you're into Greek mythology. But, these are, these represent prior political compromises or political decisions. And, they are here for reasons. Those may be good reasons, they may be bad reasons, they may be reasons that aren't valid anymore, they may be reasons that continue to be valid. But, part of that is understanding a little bit of the history, but also, understanding why we are in this, but also embracing to a certain extent that, if there are problems with this, if there are ways of doing it better, this is the opportunity, and it's rare in democracy. Go ahead. Okay, so here's a bit of the nuts and bolts and brass tacks of redistricting. So redistricting is expected to begin as soon as possible following the census. That's why we're here. As we all know, the 2020 census was a bit delayed. First step, determine the need for a charter change overall by districts and ward. That's been completed. We unfortunately have to report to you that because we have had growths and shifts in growth and population in the city, we need to do this redistricting. Current ad hoc redistricting committee meetings, feedback, and report. And as I think Megan and others have really made a great point about, is that, you know, at this level at least, we're not drawing maps, we're not making specific decisions. If you do, you're really going to get lost because you get into the weeds. This is really about getting feedback, getting these type of issues. What are people's feelings? What is the public consensus about these kind of issues? Because then you can start that next process. And that really starts at point 3. City Council develops and approves a redistricting plan that is maps. And right now, we're on a timeline where we're going from September to January, roughly, with this public feedback process. And then the City Council is going to work in this late winter and spring. Instead of going skiing, they're going to be developing the redistricting process. And then after that, you have public hearings and warnings under 17 VSA, section 2645. That's in the fall of 2022. 2 public meetings following City Council approval. These are just some of the regulations. First meeting must occur 10 days or more following public notice, but no less than 30 days before the vote. Second meeting has other requirements. These are just to make sure that these meetings are timely, that there's adequate time for feedback, that there's adequate time for voter response to this. And you know, part of this is good and part of this is, you know, can be frustrating because usually by that point, the public hearings, there's been a lot of public vetting and there's been a lot of public response. And as I said before, you know, part of what they're inviting at this process is for you to collect this public feedback. Do they have to listen to the public feedback? Technically, no, but it's one of those dangers. Be careful what you ask for. If you ask for it and you don't listen to it, that tends to irk people. Voter approval, November 2022. That's tentatively where we have it. This is last time I think we met as a group. One of the last times we met as a group, you know, we were hoping to do this in the spring, but I don't think that gave you a fair timeline to do what you need to do as a committee and get the public input. But November 2022 is still, I think, a fair number because, again, this has to go up to the legislature, which is step 6. House and Senate Government Operations Committee will review it, and of course the General Assembly will vote in between. Hopefully, if this is a workable plan that has general support, this will be a fairly straightforward process. Governor has to sign it, then we will have elections. So we're probably not talking about implementing these until the fall of 2023 at its earliest. That's presuming we go through and follow this timeline. Most likely, unless the legislature gets it in January of 2022 and immediately adopts it for some spring, but I would say that that is less likely. And so we're probably so if you think about it, we have an upcoming town meeting in the March of 2022. We know that's going to be under the existing system, and I think we can largely, if I was a waging individual, I would say the 2023 bet on 8 wards and 4 districts. So probably the 2024, which of course is the mayor's term is up as well. So that will be a big year because we may have all new wards and districts. So what more fun can you ask for in 2024? Oh, if you don't forget to use the microphone. Either side, I think.
So on number 3 on your list, there was City Council develops and approves the redistricting plan.
That's correct.
Any concerns about that?
personally or professionally?
Well, I mean, I ask because it is the very opposite of the concern about having elected officials on the listening before we have a plan to ask people to think about.
Yeah.
And then we're going to see a period of 3 months, almost 4 months, of elected officials drawing their maps.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious. I get that they can.
Right. Well, and you know, part of this is how we choose to, you know, if you think about it at the state level, the state long ago decided to adopt the redistricting committee by statute. The redistricting committee, and again, the redistricting committee is given a more specific charge than you were to actually make some of these critical decisions. So they chose to do that, and the legislature still can ignore it. And so when I say single member districts, maybe, but there's no guarantee until we hear, you know, the House and Senate leadership get on board or not, you know, take a position on it. It's just all a possibility. I think it's the same thing here, which is, I think what the goal of the city council was to maybe make your jobs a little bit easier. So rather than giving you, if you think about, and I know a couple of people on the redistricting committee at the state level, that's a lot of meetings and that's a lot of work and that's a lot of, you know, going through maps and census data and populations. What they've given you, I think, is a really good charge, which is go out and find out what the public wants. Get these big issues and bring them back to us, and we'll make the decision. And I think I don't ultimately have a problem with it because I think there are checkpoints of accountability. And I think the big checkpoint of accountability is number 5. This has to be approved by the voters.
Yeah, but the issue about the drawing is that behind closed doors or in the basement of City Hall, no one knows why a line might have been nudged to the left or right.
Yeah.
And so the point is that this creates a sense that it's a public process.
Right.
When in fact, we could leave the room and you could just put cassette recorders here and record what community offers. Yeah. Maybe some other night. Yeah. But my point is that I think that to a certain degree, what I believe in my ward, yep, the community is asking of us as representatives is to be safeguards of transparency as well as hearing. Because clearly the resolution just says, be tape recorders before we show you the map and ask people's thoughts. That is not easier, that's harder.
Right.
But I do want to I again, just want to make sure that from the context of safeguards of transparency, number 3 concerns me a great deal.
You know, and I'll let Megan chime in and maybe I'll do cleanup. Go ahead.
Yes, you can back clean up. No, I think it's a really good question, Jim. I think ultimately we're here tonight kicking off a process that the council asked for all of us to participate in. So I think if there are thoughts about how the process could work differently, it definitely would be worth sharing that with your counselors. I think the other piece about just how the maps ultimately get drawn then is that the council, in my understanding of how this process will move after the feedback has been collected, is that council will actually establish a number of criteria that they will direct the map makers to use. So there should be some level of public transparency about the direction that's given resulting from this feedback that says, this is what we want the map to do. And I would imagine that there will be public conversations where questions can be asked about that. You know, why did this boundary move? Why is this the result of the feedback we gave you? It doesn't seem like it makes sense. And that we would ultimately, you know, have those conversations at a city council meeting or at a charter change committee meeting or something like that. So there would be a chance to answer those questions.
No, and I can't say that better than Megan. I think it sort of gets to my point about, you know, you ignore public input at your own peril. And, you know, I would say that transparency is good, but, you know, ultimately, I also don't want to be too Pollyanna-ish about this, that we're talking about politics. And it reminds me of a friend of mine, you know, was once up for something, and it was board that was making the decision, and she didn't get it. And she said, God, they were playing politics. I said, really? A politically appointed board played politics? How have we not stopped the presses on that headline? You know, there is that political component to it, and I don't think it would be, but I think, you know, clearly the council has indicated that they want some level of transparency, and if it can be improved, and if there's parts of the process that you think deserve feedback, I think, you know, again, I don't want to, I can only underscore what Megan said.
This is the same vein of thought there, where my question is there a legal path forward for separating this process from elected representatives? Because that is one of the proposed questions on the redistricting survey draft. So I guess, is that actually a possibility if we get the feedback that this should be a completely separate process from elected representatives?
Yeah, it would, but it's a charter change. And that can be done either through a charter change committee or through a petition that's circulated. But, you know, just as I was, and that's part of the reason I was illustrating at the beginning, redistricting can be done any number of different ways. You know, there might be some details that I have to look through, but, you know, part of that is clearly, you know, Montpelier has its legislature, city council vote on its own districts without public input, and that's okay. They've done it for years. Burlington does it through a charter change, and there's nothing to say. That's actually the beauty of municipalities. Sorry, I'm going to wax poetic here for a moment. But municipalities are often laboratories of small level democracy. And the idea, you know, this is embodied in non-citizen voting, where the legislature can make something like that happen because municipalities are creatures of the legislature. And if the legislature says, let's try this way, then they can do it. And so if, for example, somebody came up with a brilliant idea for a nonpartisan board that was somehow elected by our wisest and sanest members of society to represent them, and the legislature thought that was a great idea, then you could easily do that. But it would be by charter change.
Okay, and could that be the very same charter change that would redistrict?
Possibly, but I guess the only thing I would caution is to be careful about how heavy you want the box to be that others lift. And if, you know, something radical, and I say radical in both a very neutral but potentially positive sense, radical change like that may not sit well with the charter change as well. It may also be part of the bargain as well. I think that's a political calculation.
Yeah,
but I know, like, for example, like Act 250, in those last couple sessions, they tried to make a lot of changes, and it was just too much. So.
And you risk having it shot down
Exactly.
completely.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then one thing to add is, I understand that this is how it works across most of the U.S. And it is definitely a big issue to take on.
Sure. Here. Oops.
I'll go first because it partly refers to what you were talking about, but I'd just like to put in a plug for the some of the feedback we've got so far has been from the MPAs, and at our last MPA meeting, Ward 1 and Ward 8, Keith Pillsbury, who is the ward clerk, came out with a raft of folder full of facts about the democracy of Ward 8. And we've asked him to speak on the agenda on the next Ward 8 MPA meeting, which is next Wednesday, the 10th. So that's going to be interesting. And if there are any relevant facts, as soon as I know where it is, I'll let everyone know. And any relevant facts, I'll try and distribute. Thanks.
Great.
Just a quick question on point number 4 up there. Do you have any idea with those public hearings, who's going to be in charge of that meeting? Is your office going to be in charge of it? Is city council going to be in charge of it? Is the ad hoc committee going to be a part of it? Because that goes to that whole issue of transparency.
That's the city council that runs those meetings by statute, and so it will probably be out of the clerk treasurer's office.
So just to make a point of clarification, because it's relevant to the question you're asking, when we are highlighting number 4 here, this is both statutory guidelines and our city process for considering a charter change. So those are the types of things that that's reflecting. So that will be handled by the city attorney's office, the council, the clerk's office, et cetera. Really, once we get past, well, really, when we get into number 3, it starts to become the city council's convening authority to, have meetings and discussions about this.
That's right.
So quickly, as a follow-up to George's question, say for an item 3A, if what are the requirements for a citizen petition on this item if there were interest in putting together an alternative charter change proposal to the one that the city council develops if the ad hoc committee itself or the public at large is not particularly happy with the outcome of the city council charter change proposal? So what's the petition requirements for a citizen requested charter change proposal?
So I apologize, I didn't realize there was going to be a pop quiz on some of this, but there is a petition threshold for a charter change. I want to say it's like 5% of the population of the city has to sign on to the petition, and that may be, please don't hold me to that number, but it's in both statute and I believe it's in our city charter, those numbers, but it requires a substantial number of signatories to get it onto the ballot. What I guess I would say is that if we get to the point where we have dueling redistricting plans, I don't know if that would not be the best thing in the world. There's an element of chaos there, but I say that cautiously only because who knows? I mean, this is democracy, and it's not always pretty. It's not always straightforward. But I think hopefully the hope would be that any city council plan took into account public sentiment. But obviously, if public sentiment is close to split, then yeah, there may be those other type of things. Then it becomes sort of dueling, charter change amendments. But let's sort of play this out in a hypothetical, because we've seen this actually in Essex recently, where you have dueling charter change amendments that are inconsistent with each other, and those did not pass. But I actually happen to represent Essex at the time, or a portion of Essex, and that was the anticipation was the legislature works this out, because ultimately charter change goes to the legislature. And even if the voters vote and they say, we want the elevator to go up, but we also want it to go down, it's up to the legislature to say which direction or reconcile the two if it's possible. Sure.
Okay, are there any more questions? I would like Megan to get a chance to talk about the census. And we're being pretty informal here tonight because we have plenty of time and we don't have a whole lot of people who want to speak, so I'm not, being my usual. So
thanks.
The people on the Zoom call are now on the screen, so you can see them, because I couldn't tell if they were asking questions. And do any of you want to ask any questions? Because we didn't give you a chance. Just yell out. Okay.
Or don't yell too loud, because when you speak, your voice just resonates in Contois Auditorium. So.
Which also means hopefully that the sound is good over there as well. And if it isn't, please let us know. So Megan is going to talk a little bit about the census.
I am seeing one hand, actually. Barbara Hedrick.
I'm sorry?
Barbara Hedrick has her hand up.
Oh, yeah. Oh, see, I can't see that for some reason. Oh, they're not all there, maybe.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, I'm wondering if it would be worthwhile to have a conversation about the city hall's plans for voting by mail. If the city is going to continue to allow people to vote by mail, then maybe the location of the polling place is not as critical as it has been in the past. And topic, for example, right now in Ward 7, they use the Miller Center for voting. And that's kept Ward 7 in its current shape because people don't want to travel so far. But if people are going to vote by mail for many years going forward, then maybe that's less of an issue. Second topic is, I thought it was an excellent presentation that the city attorney provided of what's nice to have versus what's a must have and what's a legal requirement. And I think that would be good to have in a list form so that we know that some of these considerations are not legal requirements. And I think a written list would be very useful to the ad hoc committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara. This is Dan Richardson again. I'm just going to quickly weigh in on that first part because I think it's an interesting question, and it's certainly one that we're starting to grapple with. What I would say is the death of the polling center is a little bit like everyone predicted the death of books a number of years ago. You know, we're still printing books, notwithstanding the internet and the computer. I think the polling places, we just don't know where that's going. And they're still going to be important for the foreseeable future, certainly as a public access point. But it's certainly a valid question that I think in the next 10 years is going to be, and my prediction, and strictly speaking, this is a speculation rather than any legal, is that, you know, in the 2031 redistricting, when my son is standing here instead of me and I'm in a nice retirement, I'm not that old, I'm kidding. But when that happens, I think that's going to be more salient. We're going to understand a little bit more how this voting by mail works. Because if you think about it, we've really only done a few elections this way, and we're still working out the kinks and seeing if this is in fact the way people want to vote. And I think that'll be a big question post-COVID, is if that voting by mail is so convenient and so nice that people really adapt to it, and this is just simply the way of future, or if this just becomes one other way, but polling places still remain important.
Great. All right, so as Diane said, I think this has been a really helpful opportunity to ask and answer a lot of questions and get into the weeds. So just for the sake of this meeting is being recorded and we'll post it, so anyone else that wasn't able to be here tonight can see it. So I know many of you as the ad hoc committee members have already seen some of the information that I'm about to share, but I just wanted to quickly give some context for those that are watching from home or watching in the future about the data that Dan mentioned that brought the question about redistricting to us. So this table here just shows the results of the citywide population in the last 3 census. 2000, 2010, and 2020. And what we see here is that as of 2020, the city's population is just under 45,000. So 44,743, which was a little over a 5% increase in our population since the 2010 census. And there's a link at the bottom of the screen. If you have any interest, you can look at an interactive map that the state's Center for Geographic Information created, which actually shows the population change of every town in the state of Vermont. But I think the key piece of information for the purposes of talking about redistricting is actually this information, which is how the population changed in each of the city's 8 wards. And you can see here that the bars represent the populations in 2010 and 2020 for each of the wards, and just correspond to the map on the right-hand side of the screen, which shows our current wards. So the upshot here is that almost all of the city's wards saw a population increase between 2010 and 2020, with the exception of wards 3 and 7. They remained fairly level throughout that time. The other piece of this information that's important is the idea of equal representation that we were talking about earlier. And thanks to Jeff for the clarifying question about what we mean by equal representation. We're really talking about the number of people, total people that live in each of those wards, and wanting to ensure that those wards are of roughly equal size of people. The standard that is used in determining a roughly equal size is taking the total population of the city and dividing it by the number of voting districts we have. So in Burlington's case, we divide it by 8 because that's technically the number of voting districts we have. And arrive at a population. If all of the wards were to be exactly the same size, it's our population divided by 8. And then we kind of look at the variation from that. And we're trying to find wards that are about 10% smaller or larger than that ideal size. So what this graph is showing us is that using our 2020 census numbers, the ideal size of a ward in Burlington would be about 5,600 people. And on each of these bars, you can see the 2020 population for the wards. So you can see, for example, that Ward 1 is our largest ward at a little over 6,200 people. And Ward 7 is our smallest ward with just over 5,000 people. Because we want to see each of these wards be within about 10% of the ideal size, that is kind of the first indicator for us that we needed to look at redistricting. Ward 7 is about 9% smaller than the ideal size, so technically still fits, but is really close to the edge. And Ward 1 is actually at a little over 11% larger than the ideal size, so too big for meeting that standard. We also then look at the difference between the largest and smallest wards in the city. That's another test that we can use to see if our wards are approximately equal size. And because of the difference between wards 1 and 7 and their population, we're seeing that we're actually almost double the ideal span between those wards at a little over 20%. So these ward by ward analyses are what helps us to determine that redistricting is necessary for us to consider, just on the population shift alone. So there are other data points I think that a lot of people will be interested in and that will probably be discussed throughout the process in terms of who lives in these wards and et cetera, but this is kind of the basic information for just understanding why we're redistricting. And with that,
it's time.
I'm sorry, Rama.
It's okay. So we're only looking at the wards here, but the districts play a role also. So that if you have 2 large wards that are glommed together into a district, that's going to make a large district compared to if you have 2 small wards glommed together to make a district, that's going to make a very small district. So I think we have to take that into account as well when we're looking at representation. We have to take into account the district that people are in as well as the ward they're in.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And because because the districts are actually made up of 2 wards put together, that's why we looked at the wards as the first kind of level of analysis. We did also look at what the kind of relationship to the ideal size is of the wards themselves, and they were also outside of the 10% threshold of the ideal size. I'm sorry, the districts, yes, thank you.
It turns out, though, because of averaging, that once the wards are made equal within whatever is your acceptable limit, because of averaging, the districts will also have to be within that is actually mathematically the case.
I'd like to see that because I don't understand why that would be true.
Because pick 1 and 8 together, they're the biggest wards. Their average, the district population will be exactly double of their average, of the mean of the 2.
Right.
If the 2 are brought within the limits, their mean will also be within those limits.
Okay, I'll buy that.
Okay. Are there other questions of Megan? Either folks who are remote, you can put your hand up if you want, or in the room. Okay.
All right. So I'll let Diane then walk us through the rest of the meeting.
Great. Actually, I'm going to stay over here if that's okay. I think that might be easier because then I can see the people who are remote. Sorry about that. And I know there's about 13 people actually on the Zoom, which we didn't realize. So thank you all of you for joining in. The folks who are in the room right now are all members of the committee. So we're going to let them hear from the folks who are remote now about now that you've heard all this information, and I apologize, there's a lot of information taken at once, but curious about how you all feel about how the existing system is working. 8 wards, 4 districts. I realize we probably should have said what that was, that system. So we have 8 wards in the city right now. A district is made up of 2 wards. I think this came up at one of the NPA meetings that people weren't quite clear what that meant. So that's what we have right now, so that we have an even number of counselors. We have 8 and 4. We have 12 counselors right now, which was a reduction from our last iteration. So folks out there, tell us a little bit about, do you think the system's working, not working? What are your ideas for improving it that you would like to tell our ad hoc committee who's sitting in the room? Just wave at me or put your hand up. I know you're all out there. There we go. Yeah, Sandy? Win? Sorry. I think maybe you're on mute.
There, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
So regarding Ward 8, I'm in Ward 1, but our district is 1 and 8.
Mm-hmm.
A question, when the census was taken, it was taken when I believe the entire campus was shut down and students were gone. So I suspect that Ward 8 is even larger than what the census numbers say, because many students probably put their parents' address where they were, rather than where they technically should have been living on April 1, physically where they were living on April 1 was not necessarily even in Vermont. So we question just how valid the current number is for Ward 8. I suspect the number is much larger.
And tell me, Sandy, also, are you interested in seeing the student wards stay together or
no,
seeing them?
No, and I think
no, okay.
Looking at all you have to do is look at the shape of Ward 8, and it clearly is a gerrymandered ward to wrap around to just include students. If you look at the number of actually single-family homes that are not rentals in that ward, you can probably count them on 2 hands. It clearly, whoever or however that decision was made, just intellectually, you'd have to challenge what were they thinking. Anyway, my thoughts.
Okay, Megan.
And if you don't mind, I do just want to speak to the question about how students were counted in this census, because it has come up before. So Pitt and the other folks at CEDO were part of a local complete count committee that was doing a lot of work to try to get out the word about participating in the census. And we also became very concerned about that issue when it was clear that the campus was going to close. The census actually knew that this was going to be an issue in a lot of communities and immediately began communicating to communities and to complete count committees like the CEDO office set up to make sure that students were told to answer the census as if they were still living where they would have been living on April 1st had they not been sent home from campus. So that was one thing. And the other thing is that campuses were able to kind of bulk report data about occupied beds in the dorms, at least on their campus, which helps us to ground truth some of that information. So I don't think that there is a major discrepancy in the reporting there, but it's certainly possible a few people could have been missed.
And Megan, do you have a sense of what led to the student district, or maybe Anne? I honestly don't remember. No, okay, all right. Did anybody?
To be honest, I didn't live in Burlington when that happened,
Oh my
so
gosh,
I don't
okay.
remember.
I'm sort of embarrassed to say I did, but do you know, Anne? Why they had the student, they particularly made Ward A to be a particular, primarily student district, or ward, I should say? Okay, Anne's going to come and try to answer this question, and maybe Jim will add something to it as well.
I mean, I could probably answer the question too, but
Yeah,
I don't know if people want to hear it from me.
Okay, let's Anne try first, and then we'll go to you. Yep.
Yeah, I wasn't part of the redistricting effort back then, and I know I've had conversations with Robert about this after the fact, and I know he can probably shed more light on that than I can.
Okay, great. Robert, do you want to help us answer that question?
This is difficult. So if anybody is to blame, it's me. The map that we have now, the exact map that we have, there were 2 8-ward maps that I drew. And on the voter feedback time, this is just before it went to ballot, the 2 maps were being decided by city council and this current map was chosen. It was drawn by me when I was working, I do a lot of work outside of town, and I was in California. I was sitting in a Malibu's, or I was sitting in a Starbucks in Malibu when the current map that we have got drawn. The reason why the 8-ward map came into being was not directly because we were trying to get students represented. It was the incidental reason. The real reason was that nobody in the existing 7 wards wanted to get their ward mangled when somebody else didn't. And in 2013, there were lots of maps being drawn, and the division was really between the South and the North. Pretty much every map that was drawn by somebody in the south of the town kept wards 5 and 6, and most of the city pretty much intact, but wards 4 and 7 got mangled in some way. And the political impetus was different. I did not share this value, but there were some people up in the New North End that what would have happened if we would have kept the 7 wards, we would have had to expand Ward 7 into the old North End even further than it was. And there were some folks that didn't want people voting in the new North End that were from the old North End. That wasn't me. My issue about that was I didn't think it was very good to make people from, say, Convent Square or Manhattan Drive have to go up to the Miller Center to vote. And so since wards 4 and 7 were smaller than the other wards, the only way to keep wards 4 and 7 the same was to make the other 5 wards a little smaller and have that spill into a new 8th ward. Now that new 8th ward would have to be at the nexus of where these existing bigger wards were, namely where Ward 6 and Ward 1 and Ward 2 and Ward 3 come together. And that's where Ward 8 appeared at. We knew it would have been student dominated. The very first version of that map, and I could probably, if I share screen, I could probably bring it up.
We don't have you do that right now because we do have other people who want to speak, okay?
All right, but the very first one.
Done on purpose. I think that was really.
Oh, no, well, it was done with a full knowledge that, it was done with a full knowledge that Ward 8 was going to be a student-dominated ward.
Right, okay, great. Then Jim, do you want to add something?
I would just say, having been in town at the time and having been on the committee, that actually part of what was the part that has to do with the students really was that we were hoping to see more youth engagement. And so while it may have served some of the purposes that Robert is speaking to, there was a lot of conversation about how do we engage youth in city politics. And so there was, what we were starting to see is pairing of high school students with college students as mentor-mentee and engaging them in committees in City Hall and that sort of thing. That's really where it was designed to think, well, how do we actually think about college students? Has it played out that way? That's for people to think of. But I can tell you that it was intentional when we were trying to figure out about student engagement.
Good. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so are there other folks? I think Lee has her hand up. Terhune, yep. You may have to unmute, Lee.
Appears to be unmuted.
No?
Lee, you look like you're unmuted.
There we go. Can you hear us, Lee? We can't hear you yet. Technical difficulty? Oh, there you go. No? Yeah, we still can't hear you, Lee. I'm not sure why. Any theories from the Zoom folks? No? No?
How's this?
Yeah, now you're good.
Okay, okay. You know, I don't know why you close off Q&A and chat in these meetings. I think it's a valuable communication tool. Like right there, we could have communicated this mute, unmute thing if your question thing was open. I'd like you to answer that question afterwards, why you close those off. Anyway, I thought Jim Hallway had a really good answer. And I wanted to point out that the redistricting committee, which I also was on, we were primarily concerned about democracy. We were concerned about people having the most direct representation, the most direct connection with their counselors. The district idea was not ours. We never even talked about that possibility. We liked 8 wards, small wards, 2 counselors per ward, which gives people, the residents, the most representation. As far as college students go, they make up 25% of our city's population. That means they pay a good bit of taxes in this town. So while people will say students shouldn't be on council because they don't pay taxes, they most certainly do. They pay sales tax. They pay property taxes through their rent. They pay tax. I think they probably pay more taxes than a lot of residents here because they shop so much and pay retail tax and rooms and meals tax and things like that. So our committee really wanted to see college students, young people, more representation. And I wanted to say, in terms of the work we're doing now, that we should have the same goal. Our goal should be the most representative democracy that we can accomplish with redistricting. We shouldn't be concerned about protecting incumbency. And by the way, nobody mentioned that as to why the Ward 8 got shaped the way it did. But most city councilors will admit that it got shaped the way it did to protect incumbency in that area. And I don't know why nobody wanted to say that out loud. Anyway, democracy, representative democracy, small wards, 2 counselors per ward.
Thank you so much, Lee. We appreciate it. Are there other folks who want to weigh in? I can't see you, so somebody needs to let me know. Megan? No? Any other hands? Yep.
May I just say one other thing about the 8-ward map? The one numerical thing that was accomplished with it is that 82% of the city got to stay in the same ward and vote in the same place. And that would not have happened with any other map at all. And it was probably everybody watching out for their backyard, whether it was incumbents watching out for their hind end, or whether it was voters just not wanting to go to a different ward. 82% of the city got to stay in the same ward and vote at the same place.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. Anybody else? Hands? We're just checking to see.
I'd like to know if Barbara Hedrick is still here. She put a lot of time and effort into actually working with the mapping device, and she came up with something very interesting. And if she's still here, I'd like her to talk about that a little bit, at least, and talk about the process of how she worked with that.
Barbara, if you're there and would like to share, please do. But just remember that we're not actually dealing with mapping tonight. We're not there yet. So we're looking at the big questions. But
my question,
add what you can if you're willing.
Yeah. I am here, and I won't go into the details of the map, but what I did is I just tried to think about what wards 4 and 7 wanted from the last time we went through the redistricting. And I thought about the personality and the culture of each different neighborhood. And I talked to different people in different neighborhoods and heard what they wanted. And I just tried to design the new proposed boundaries in a way that I thought would please all wards. And they're just sort of penciled in lines. They're just an idea for people to tweak and change as needed. I did not try to put any constraints on, like it has to be on a major road or it has to be clunky and square. I just tried to really focus in on what are the issues that are common to certain neighborhoods, so those neighborhoods could be joined together. And I think that's really important for the survey, if you ever do one. Don't use a survey that's going to result in something that people don't want. You have to have neighborhoods that are cohesive based on common issues that they're addressing. Thanks, ladies. I hope that answers your question.
Do you think that, so what you heard was that was really the number one priority that folks wanted, was the neighborhood cohesiveness? Is that what you heard? I just want to make sure
I heard, for example, between the last time this top redistricting happened and this time is, there are certain things that Ward 7 and Ward 4 people want. Ward 2 and 3 want something different. So I just tried to reflect those in how I drew that straw model.
Okay, great, thank you. Others? On the
what I think is important about the mapping, is that part of the transparency of this depends on whether or not we trust. For example, what Robert said was that Salamander Ward 8 was the only thing that would work. The only thing that would work?
It's the only one that would get us 82%.
Well, I think if people can do the mapping themselves, they can check that.
Okay.
This is with the 2010 numbers. I'm not saying it would be now.
And we have
Yeah, I get it. I understand.
Okay, I have another person who has their hand up. Joan, Shannon?
Yes.
There's,
Hi.
Hi.
Hi there. I was also on the redistricting committee and just want to say my advice would be to move on from the process that we had last time, that I think most people who participated in it felt it was awful. And to say that we, the redistricting committee, wanted any one particular thing, I think that's pretty hard to say, because there was a lot of disagreement about what we wanted. And what we wanted largely depended on where we lived. The eight wards, the concept of 8 wards, I think was favored by people who lived in the New North End, who wanted to continue to have 2 wards in the New North End. So it served that purpose. And there was also advocacy for a student ward at the time. And those aren't things that I personally agreed with, but majority rules. And at the end of the day, we were simply looking for a solution that could get a majority vote in a very divisive situation. So it was a matter of just getting, I think, well, we have 14 counselors, so we needed 8 votes to pass something. So what we passed was by virtue of that was the only thing that could garner 8 votes at that time. I don't think it could be argued that it was the best or only solution. And hopefully we will come up with something better in this process. I do agree, despite being an incumbent, I would say I agree with Lee that incumbency is really not the most important thing to be concerned about. But that's the end of my history with this.
Okay, thanks, Joan. Others? Carol.
Hi, I just want to raise the issue about what we continue calling the student ward, and just I hear people's positive efforts to make that decision. Just a plug in a couple of things about the reality of it is, for example, it's very hard to campaign in Ward 8. UVM is not at all helpful in making the dorms or even the student center available for people to just meet with students. So even just the whole process of trying to involve students in council elections or ordinances or whatever we're voting on, resolutions. And Keith Pillsbury from Ward 8, who's the ward clerk, as Richard said, he can count, he can go through with you all the difficulties it is to even just get people to man the clerk's office, the election clerk's office when they need to vote. He's looking to other places for December's vote because he won't get the support that he needs to run an election in that ward. So I just think we need to think carefully about what our goal was and how we get the information that really represents that goal. Who is saying that? Who wants that? Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Appreciate that. Others? Okay, I think at this point we want to try something that we would normally do. Since we don't have members of the public in the room, we're not going to do our dotmocracy, but we have something set up online that I'd like to see, do a test run and see if it works. So I'm going to actually ask the folks who are remote to be our guinea pigs for this. And people in the room, oh, that's right, we can do it. It's called a Menti, and we have a slide up here. Maybe Megan will explain how to use it. And this is just going to give us a little straw poll of the criteria that we talked about and kind of having you prioritize them to give us a little bit of information.
So yeah, as Diane said, this is an opportunity that we're trying out in this hybrid meeting format to allow people to weigh in on these criteria. So we're going to make one of these for each of your meetings that you'll be able to participate in during the meeting or after. So on the screen, there's a link, menti.com. You can go to that on either a computer or a smartphone right now and enter in this 8-digit code. Yes, it's 3509-8145. So sorry, I walked away from the microphone, talking to the people in the room. When you go to this site, you'll see two different opportunities to weigh in. The first is asking you about the criteria that are related to the size and the configuration of the council. So the questions about, do you like 8 wards and 4 districts? Do you like having 12 counselors, et cetera? The second screen will ask you questions about how the ward boundaries are drawn. So what is available to you is a slider for each of these criteria. If you slide it to the right, you're indicating that it's one of your top priorities for consideration in this process. If you don't think it's a priority or one of your top priorities, don't slide the little dot across the line. So we're testing out this format to see if it'll work. And in just a second, I'm going to go to the Menti and actually start it so that you can actually participate in it.
Megan, can I ask a question about number 3?
Sure. The question is about the third one. Actually, let me go to it so that I can.
Maintain an even number for council? Yes. I understand the idea of avoiding high votes, but is it or is it not true that the mayor has the legal authority to vote in case of a tie?
I actually would like the city attorney to weigh in on that. I don't think that that's true. Or maybe Councilor Shannon, if you could confirm that.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
The question was whether or not the mayor has the ability to vote in a tie vote. I don't think that that's true, right?
The mayor, I think the mayor may get a vote on this, not a vote in a tie vote, but has a vote on the particular body that makes this decision. Because it's technical, I'm trying to think what it's called, the Board of Civil Authority, which includes the mayor. It's technically not the city council. So the Board of Civil Authority is the council with the mayor.
So are you asking about the process of, yeah, can he break a tie? Right, in a regular city council meeting. I think that's the.
Oh, regular city council meetings, no, he can't.
Yeah, okay. Which is why that question is a key question. Okay. It is 3509-8145. And I'm going to try to share my screen again so that I can show you all. Carol, do you still have a question?
No, I'm sorry, I'm lowering my hand. I apologize.
Great. And Barbara, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to say, I think that these surveys can really send the wrong information because people don't really know the ramifications of what they're, when you say, oh, let's have 8 or 10 wards, that could look like anything. It doesn't necessarily come out to be something good.
Right. And so I think we're not asking for anyone to provide a specific number of wards. We're asking for feedback on the current number of wards, if you think it is a priority to maintain or not. Same with districts. If you think it's a priority to maintain the current number of districts or not. We're trying to get a general sense of how people feel about the plans today, right? Right. Sure, that's a great piece of feedback. All right, so what I'm showing here on the screen is actually your live participation here. So as people in the room and online are choosing which of their priorities for council size and composition, we can see the bar starts to get bigger. So it looks like there are definitely a number of votes, 5 people who have indicated that keeping the current number of wards is a priority for them. Maintaining an even number of counselors also has 5 people who have voted for it. And we can see it looks like 1 or 2 folks have indicated that some of these other criteria are in their top 5. So it says 1.6. So I think it's just trying to create an average of how many people have voted for this.
I was thinking, oh my gosh, we have 17 people online doing this.
This may be, and this is why we're testing this. We can see if this is actually too confusing a way for people to indicate. So you don't really vote from 1 to 5. You're actually just voting, if you keep the dot on the left on your screen, it's not one of your priorities. If you move the dot to the right on your screen, it is one of your priorities. So these numbers that are here are just, we can just disregard that. It's kind of averaging things.
We really wanted to prioritize, 1 to 5 like you do dots, but this program wouldn't allow us to do it, and we only figured that out a little while ago. So.
Right. So, I mean, we can try to tweak this a little bit more for the future. Yeah, I think ultimately we're not worried about the numbers. We just want to see, is this one of your top priorities? And right now what I'm seeing is that, for example, 5 people have said keeping 8 wards is one of their top priorities. So we can look at the next one. The question is about your priorities for how the ward boundaries are drawn. And these are some of the criteria that Dan talked to us about earlier today. And right now it looks like we have fewer people that have answered these questions. So I'll give folks a second if they want to weigh in on some of these questions about priorities for drawing the ward boundaries. Again, slide the little dot to the right, all the way to the right line, if you think that this is one of your highest priorities for the redistricting process for drawing boundaries.
And we were really here looking for magnitude. I think that's what, and honestly, it seemed like it might be kind of fun. I mean, and maybe it's not. And we don't have to do it for our other meetings, but we thought we'd throw it out. Okay, I think we're going to close that one up.
So right now it looks like we have kind of a split on folks who think that they want to minimize the population difference between wards. Similarly, a split between keeping neighborhoods and geographies intact. About 4 people said yes, and 4 people said that's not one of their highest priorities. Fewer people are concerned about following major roadways and natural boundaries. Fewer people said that it was a priority to create a relationship between city and state districts. And so far, no one has said that it's a priority to keep students in one ward.
All right, well, thank you for being our guinea pigs. We'll continue to work on that. Yes, Anne?
I just have a question about the top one, the minimized population difference between wards. Isn't that a must-have?
Yeah.
So should that even be in the question, one of the questions?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question.
Good point.
I mean, you can minimize the. You could say it just has to be within 10%, or you could say, oh, it should be really as close as possible to even.
Yeah, that's
So,
a good point. Yep. How close to even is it, or how close to ideal? Yep.
I had a question about the whole Ward 8 thing. So, I mean, if I were a student, I mean, there's 2 ways of looking at it. You could say, okay, the students get to vote as a block, and they would have more influence that way. But you could also say, oh, we put all the students in one block so that they're not going to have as much influence. So, I think that there, in terms of respecting, I forget what Dan's words were, but you can't put all the people of this particular religion in one block. You can't put all the people of a particular race in one ward, because that would, although it looks prima facie like they're getting power, you're actually diluting their power by putting them all in one spot. So how are the students feeling about being all in one ward? Are they happy about it? Are they unhappy? Do they care?
I think that
Do we care what they care?
this ad hoc committee to try to find some feedback about.
So I think we don't know yet. I was interviewed yesterday by the Vermont Cynic. So I think there's going to be a forthcoming article about this. But I think we need their participation to know what they think.
Excellent.
Okay, I think we've got only 10 minutes left, believe it or not. We've used up all our time. And I really wanted to give the committee, I think George is going to talk a little bit about the survey that you all are doing to make sure that folks out there know about it. As he's coming up, I just want to also state that the agenda has a list of our upcoming meetings, and I just want to be sure we didn't put it on a slide. I apologize. The meeting at next listening session is November 17th, 5 to 7 p.m. at the Miller Center in the New North End on Goss Court. December 6th, 6 to 8 p.m. Unfortunately, this is also called the Miller Center, and I apologize for this. This is the Champlain College Miller Center at 175 Lakeside Avenue, so the south end. Those are our upcoming meetings. They will be on the website if they're not, and they're also on the agenda. So, George, I'm going to turn it over to you for the survey.
So just to talk generally about how the process is going, we're hoping to schedule a committee-wide meeting. I believe that was the consensus in our last planning meeting, was to have yet another planning meeting about the survey in particular. And one of the things that I think is a priority to look at is how the list of priorities is actually explained to the public in a short enough format that their attention is maintained and without too much legal language in there so that everyone will be able to understand what, some of the implications of these priorities would be. Obviously, it's a very complicated topic, and we can't talk about all the implications, but I'm hoping by having input from the whole redistricting committee that we'll be able to flush out something that is representative of the whole city, and I also am prioritizing that because I think the ranking priorities question is is really important because of the conflicting guidelines that we've been given. Yeah, in terms of the rest of the survey, there was some very brief discussion last time about demographic questions, which are currently in the draft, where we asked folks about whether they're renter, homeowner, what their income level is. Also for the school board commission, how many school-age children are in the household. So there was some hesitation about including those, just I think because it lengthens the survey, and then also because people might be uncomfortable with income questions, but I would also like that to all get flushed out at the next meeting.
Can I just ask when you expect to have the survey out and how you're going to distribute it, if you know?
So my current proposal for distributing the survey would be to distribute it at each of these public meetings. But in addition to that, distributing it on public forums such as Front Porch, Facebook, and additionally having either CETO assist with canvassing the city and go door to door if that's not possible. You know, taking a sample of the city and trying to reach out face to face with people. I think that's always the most effective way to get feedback that's genuine. My current proposal has a small graphic that can be left on hanging on people's doorknobs with a link to the survey if people aren't around. But yeah, that's generally what I'm proposing, and we have yet to have a planning meeting about the survey specifically, so it's hard to tell what us as a committee has decided on.
Okay, but we just want everyone to stay tuned. It's coming. That's what I really want to be, so people keep an eye out for it, especially if it's something that you are particularly interested in. Since you've come tonight, I'm sure you are. So more information to follow on that. Hopefully we'll know more even by the 17th by our next public meeting, yeah?
Yeah, and I want to also point out that we considered rushing the survey to fruition in order to get it out in an issue of the community newspaper last meeting, but we decided against that because, as many members of the public have pointed out, surveys, if they're not done right, can simply add confusion and not produce valuable information. So I think that planning meeting will be really essential.
Great. And Ann, you want to add something?
I have a question for George. So our final committee meeting is December 6th? December
15th.
15th, okay. Is that the date where we're going to hash out the survey questions?
I believe what we said last time was that we wanted to schedule an additional meeting somewhere in the month of November, I'd assume. Okay. Yeah, if that's acceptable for people's schedules. I know the timeline has been all over the place. So.
Okay, so this survey could potentially be available by sometime in December.
I would hope so, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, good. So stay tuned.
I understand why you didn't want to put the survey in the deadline was a couple days ago, but what about putting it in the next issue of the community news?
Is that a possibility? When is the next date? Do you know? Anybody know? Lee, do you know what the next date is, due date?
No, but it's about the same. It'll be towards the end of November and it'll appear in early December.
Okay.
Yeah,
We'll definitely see what we can do.
It's just important to realize that in the New North End, people are more likely to respond to a paper survey, as well as seniors. And a barcode on a door knocker isn't going to get used in the New North End the way it might be used in, say, Ward 1 or Ward 8. So we really need people to have that hard copy survey in hand. And the community news has a lot of stuff in it about schools. So although we've been light on including the school districts in all of this discussion, I don't think there's one person on the committee now that is advocating for schools. I could be wrong about that. But that community news has sports information in it, school information, city councilor reports. A lot of people read that. It's mailed to every residency in the city.
Okay, we will definitely take a look at that and see if we can pull that off.
Yeah, and just to go into more details about distribution real quick, that was definitely a consideration. Paper survey at the door would be priority. And then after that, there would be the barcode option, but also an option to call into the CEDO front desk in order to fill it out by phone.
Great. Thanks so much. Appreciate it, George.
And I believe
Jim,
Barbara's had her
oh,
hand
sorry.
up.
And Jim, you want to add something? December 1st. Okay, so deadline for the community news. Barbara, did you want to add something?
I just want to make sure that the survey doesn't lead us to the wrong conclusions, because when people say they want the boundary lines down the middle of major streets, they're not going to know the ramifications of that. And some of these things are just considerations, nice to have, they're not must-haves. So please be very careful designing that survey and interpreting the results.
Great. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. All right, I think we're just about 8 o'clock, we're gonna wrap up. Next project, we've got 2 more public listening sessions coming up. Again, they're hopefully on the website and on the agenda. And there we go, that's our process moving forward. So the meetings will be the same format, which you're welcome to join again if you'd like. But please invite your friends, family, neighbors, et cetera, because we'd like to have a big crowd. So next meeting, November 17th at the Miller Center in the New North End. So thank you all so much for coming.